Thank you so much for joining us today for Legal Issues for Documentary Filmmakers, part of the Tennessee Film and Entertainment webinar series hosted by the Arts and Business Council of Greater Nashville and supported by the Tennessee Entertainment Commission. Again, welcome. My name is Jonathan Harwell-Dye. I'm the Director of Programs for the Arts and Business Council of Greater Nashville. We are an independent 501c3 nonprofit that leverages and unites the unique resources of the arts and business communities to create a thriving, sustainable, creative culture in Nashville. We do this by providing education, resources, and opportunities to the creative community while connecting the business community to the arts to foster workplace creativity and innovation. When you become a member of the Arts and Business Council, you join artists, arts lovers, creative organizations, and leading Nashville area companies in cultivating our creative community. You can follow the link in the chat to learn more about the benefits of membership with ABC. I'm also excited to announce that we are continuing our Periscope Rural Artist Development Program in 2024. Periscope RAD is open to artists living in rural counties in Tennessee. It's an annual online training and mentorship opportunity uniquely designed to be a transformative experience, empowering rural artists with the entrepreneurial skills they need to thrive. Training sessions are led by expert business professionals, and small group work is facilitated by top arts professionals from across the state. If you're an artist, actor, filmmaker, or musician, we encourage you to apply for the 2024 cohort. And you can join us this Friday, October 20th, for an information session online to learn more about the program, the application process, and answer any questions that you may have about Periscope RAD. ABC's flagship program is the Volunteer Lawyers and Professionals for the Arts, or VLPA for short, which is a referral service providing pro bono legal assistance for income-qualified artists, arts organizations, and creative businesses in Tennessee. VLPA services include quarterly pro bono legal clinics for artists, musicians, and creatives. The next in-person clinic will be held on November 1st at CMA's offices on Music Row here in Nashville. You can complete the VLPA intake form linked in the chat to start the registration process today. Please note that you will be required to provide proof of income to qualify for free legal services through VLPA. We also host a monthly virtual Black-owned small business and nonprofit legal clinic with our partners at the Bradley Law Firm. Tennessee small businesses that are at least 51% Black-owned with less than $1 million in annual revenue and 10 or fewer employees are eligible. The October clinic is currently full, but there are appointments available for the November clinic. You can follow the link in the chat to secure your spot. I'm also thrilled to announce that the expansion of the Arts and Business Council's fiscal sponsorship program to support independent filmmakers and documentarians throughout Tennessee. Fiscal sponsorship provides essential support for film and documentary projects, including the ability to receive tax-deductible donations and grants, enhancing access to funding opportunities, including funding through government agencies, foundations, trusts, individuals, and philanthropic entities that require IRS nonprofit status. Eligible media projects must be independent or documentary endeavors, encompassing formats such as short or feature films, television or docuseries, web series, podcast, and experimental and immersive media. Projects are required to be produced in the state of Tennessee with at least 51% of production occurring in the state. You can learn more at the link in the chat. And with that, let's watch a short video from the Tennessee Entertainment Commission about the impact of film, music, and entertainment in the state of Tennessee. As you can see, the entertainment industry in Tennessee is a huge economic driver, and we appreciate the Tennessee Entertainment Commission's support of all of Tennessee's creative industries and for supporting this webinar series. William L. Whitacre is an entertainment attorney with over 3 decades of experience in film, music, and television. His screen credits as attorney include the most successful independent film in history, the iconic Blair Witch Project, as well as films with Academy Award-winning actors produced in locations from Universal Studios Florida to Vancouver to Hong Kong. Mr. Whitacre's documentary film credits include Dove Award-winning A Dog's Life, The Oscar Lost Story, and the Regional Emmy Winning WASP, A Wartime Experiment in Woman Power, as well as Silver Wings and Civil Rights, the Tuskegee Airmen story, winner of the Audience Award at the Miami International Film Festival. Please join me in welcoming William Whitacre. William, thank you for being here today.
Hey, thanks, Jonathan. Thank you all for being with us today. This is a wonderful opportunity that the Arts Council and the Tennessee Entertainment Commission are providing to everyone. And it's really an honor for me to be able to participate with you. I hope this presentation will be informative and maybe even a little entertaining. And please save your questions for the end. I'll try and include some stories and examples from real life experiences that I've had. And one of the things I would say right off the bat is the Blair Witch Project opened a lot of doors for me. And the reason I want to bring it up at the beginning of this presentation is to inspire you. The guys who created that were 5 college students who just wanted to make movies. They had no money, no credits. They were in their teens or early 20s. And the idea of being able to make a movie that would earn $140 million the year after they made it was probably the farthest thing from their minds. They started out trying to think, how can we make a movie with no money? So they employed what we call guerrilla film tactics. That is, things that look good on screen, but don't cost you a lot of dough. Well, in their case, the marketing gimmick and brilliance behind Blair Witch was, if we convince people that this is a student film, they won't expect it to look like a Hollywood movie, right? The camera will be shaky, the sound may not be great, there won't be any fancy sets or wardrobe. Okay, great. But now, where are we going to do this? And what's our concept? And they said, well, what's scary? Well, witches. Yeah, great. But we don't have any money to even make a witch effect. So what else is scary? The woods at night. Right, that's scary. So they came up with this idea to originally promote their film as what's now being called a mockumentary. It was supposed to be a documentary made by filmmakers who were exploring a legend of a witch in this county in Maryland. And it was promoted as that. And even one of the mothers of a young lawyer who was working with me, when they saw the behind the scenes before the film came out in theaters, she said, it's terrible what happened to those kids. Because at the end, of course, the film ends with the camera falling down, and then their camera and tapes were found later, and supposedly the witch got them. But it was an example of how pure inspiration can turn into something very successful without a lot of capital. So don't ever underestimate yourself and your creativity, because everything in our business comes from somebody's mind of an idea for a poem, a song, a story. You know, Nashville, Music City, right? The song. But every song is like a 3-act play. It's got a beginning, middle, and end, just like a film, a poem, a play, a movie. So my opening to you is simply trust your creativity. Don't second guess that, and keep creating in whatever mode is good for you. And if you have passion for something, pursue it. Now, when we go through this and we start the slides in a minute, I don't want you to feel that you have to take heavy notes to get these URLs or links, because I provided Jonathan a printable version of my outline, and it will have all the links for you on there. So hopefully you can just sit back and maybe enjoy a few of the stories. And I've tried to include some graphics that'll make it a little more visually interesting. But if we start the screen sharing, we'll just start with the slide part of this and go from there. Okay, so you should have this introductory screen on there, which just tells us who's doing this and what it's all about, which is going to be what is a documentary? Okay, the poster we're seeing here is from a 1922 film. A guy went out with a camera and he made this, he just recorded these Eskimo peoples, native peoples, way up there near the Arctic Circle. And you'll notice in the caption on that poster, it says actual, the actual Arctic. That was the key to this. You remember, motion pictures were just coming into being in the 20s and 30s. So just like art, if you think back, if any of you have studied art history, in the beginning, painters were realists. They painted portraits and landscapes and realism. And then later, when the camera came in, the artists who used painting as a expression, well, they were freed up to do other things. So the documentary film originally was there's two elements to this that you should focus on. One is, what is it? What is its content? It's supposed to be realistic or true. And secondly, it's supposed to have some kind of purpose, to either educate or create a record. So if you want to look at the whole history of documentary film, there's a link next to the history word there that will show you a lot of that. And it's pretty interesting. But this Nanook of the North was supposedly a prototype for an early documentary film. And you'll notice that films that came along at that time didn't even have sound. So there were different elements that were either recreations of reality or actual filming of real things. But the concept of separating films into documentary versus dramatic films wasn't around yet. What I hope you'll take from this time we're going to spend together today is just an overall working knowledge. If you're a filmmaker or if you're an attorney, you may not be primarily responsible for all of the legal issues that are involved in either a client or co-producer or friend's film. But if you have a working knowledge of what's involved, it will help you select the people on your team to bring it through. And one thing I want to focus on now that we'll end with is the concept of distribution. The reason all this legal stuff is important is because at the end of your process, when you've got a completed film, if you're just using it as an art film or private screenings, that's great. But if you want to sell it to a documentary channel or get it in an art house theater or have any kind of return on it, you're going to have to show the distributor who's helping you put it out that you have met all of these necessary legal requirements. And what we call this is delivery. It's the same as if you buy a car, you got to sign all those papers at the car dealer. Or if you're buying a home or renting, you got to sign a lease agreement or go through the closing. That's what the delivery part of the legal is on any film, including a documentary. And documentaries it's very important because let's say you get your film to go on Netflix. Well, Netflix has a deep pocket, right? If somebody sues Netflix because you didn't do something right, you didn't get a permission, let's say, for an interview, then Netflix has got to be responsible for that lawsuit. So they're going to require you as a filmmaker to obtain insurance. And we'll talk about that more later. But the point I want you to remember is when you're going into the process as an attorney advising a client or as a filmmaker, you want to be aware of these requirements. I've had people come into my office with a shoebox full of papers and say, can you help me sort this out? I got somebody who's interested in my movie from looking at the presentation piece, but they said something about chain of title and copyright. We didn't really do any of that. We just kind of did it on the fly. So if you're aware ahead of time of some of these requirements that are presented in the materials we'll talk about today, it will help you tremendously at the end of the line. So the documentary is just a particular format. It's different from a fictional depiction of something. So we'll go on to a slide here, gives you an example. There are types of material that you can put in a documentary. Now, Civil War, which is a film that Ken Burns made, is one of the most famous documentaries that was ever on PBS. But think about this. There were photographs from the Civil War, but there were no interviews of people. There were no film motion picture footage. So this documentary is an example of how you can do a historical documentary and still make it interesting. What he did was he might start with, say, that picture right there, the soldier standing next to a cannon. And he might start talking about the role of African-American soldiers in the Civil War. And he might at that point zoom in on that soldier's face. And that's just, it's an editing capability that you have in Final Cut Pro or whatever software is being used to edit a film. You can start on one side of a photograph and pan across it slowly, or you can zoom in on it. So there are ways to make still photographs interesting in a documentary. Now, another content, Danny Trejo's poster here, Inmate Number 1. Well, like a lot of creative people, including country music singers and others in all kinds of entertainment media, Danny had his troubles with the law early on. And he's one of the most famous character actors and lead actors, really, because of that face, to appear in films. But this was his story, the rise of Danny Trejo. How did Danny come out of where he started and end up as a very popular actor? Some of you may remember him from Robert Rodriguez, Desperado, where he was one of the bad guys. So Danny's an example of a documentary that is centering on one person, and whoever the filmmaker was had to get permission, obviously, from Danny and his cooperation and all of his rights in order to do that. Somebody can't just go say, I'm going to do a documentary about Danny Trejo and collect a bunch of pictures and footage. So I had a chance one time during a feature film to spend a night with Danny on a set. And he's really a cool guy. And I'll tell you just two sort of interesting things about him. One was he said he gets a lot of offers to be in movies, and he just likes to try different food. So he'll tell his agent to find out where the film is going to be and are there any decent restaurants or places or food that he can try. And the other thing is that he has a little dog, it's a dachshund, and his name is Cheeto. So Danny was very forgiving, and he's an example of an interview subject for an entire film. So you can have print media. A lot of people will show old newspaper photographs or copy, for example, to set the scene. And then if it's a later day documentary, you have audio and also film sources. So those are the types of material. Now, what are the sources for the material? Well, there are a lot of free sources for documentary material. The Library of Congress is one. It has an extensive database of photographs, movies, audio material, music of all kinds, and it's available without cost. There are also many government organizations and nonprofit organizations that specialize in certain things. And they have archives of photographs, interviews, people that you can connect with. Museums have extensive archives. And of course, libraries and news organizations. So there are places such as that you can look at for sources of your material. Okay, so going on to a couple of examples. Gunslingers, you see the poster on the left from History Channel. it was what we call an episodic series. In other words, it dealt with gunslingers in the Old West. And if you think about what was the Old West, there was the Western expansion. And after the Civil War, they were building railroads out west and trying to expand the commerce. And there was a period of time when the Spanish came to North America, they brought cattle with them. And when they left a bunch of the cattle. And those cattle got into huge free-ranging herds in the prairies of North America. And when people figured out they could round them up, you've heard of a roundup, they started going out and rounding up cattle and driving them to the railroads to be shipped to the stockyards in Chicago. And those were called the cattle drives. Well, during that time, these cities along the way, Dodge City, Abilene, etc., they sprung up and they took advantage of the cowboys when they were done with the cattle drive. So Gunslingers was a series that focused on this short period of time in the late 1800s when the cowboys were king. And the gunslingers were the rule of law because there wasn't much law enforcement. So one of the most famous episodes in the Old West, of course, was the gunfight at the OK Corral. It's a legendary gunfight that took place in Tombstone that involved Wyatt Earp, one of the most famous cowboys. That's Wyatt there in the hat on the right there on the slide. And so Gunslingers spent one entire episode on what they called the Tombstone Vendetta. And its primary source was a book that Wyatt Earp wrote about his own life, including his shootout in the OK Corral. So if you're interested in looking at that, that's the first episode of season 1 in Gunslingers, a series that appeared on the History Channel. Now, the gunfight at the OK Corral was also portrayed in the movie Tombstone, where a lot of you remember Doc Holliday, that's a peach of the hand. You're a daisy if you do. He had a great character depiction of Doc Holliday in that movie. But that movie, although it's centered on a factual event, it wasn't necessarily true to actual dialogue and fact. And there are many examples of this. For example, in publishing, Gore Vidal wrote a famous novel called Lincoln. And it's about Lincoln and the relationship with his generals in the Civil War and his political, but nobody knows what was really said other than maybe what Lincoln wrote. So people fill in the gaps. So the Tombstone movie is an example of a recreation of a historical event, but it wouldn't be considered a documentary, even though it deals with something in actual fact. Gunslingers, however, is in a documentary format because it comes from primary source material and depicts an actual event. So there are different approaches to history and how they're depicted in film. And one thing we ought to remember when we say film is like saying tape. It doesn't really exist in our business anymore. My wife will say, "Did you tape that show for me?" Because she's still thinking about the old video days. And we have to remember that tape and film, that's what we call linear technologies. To get from the beginning to the end, you got to wind up something, fast forward it. Well, now that we're in the digital age, we can jump from end to beginning and back and forth digitally, instantly, because we're in that digital medium. So film refers now more to a motion picture than it does to the process. Yes, people are still shooting film as a primary source medium, but that, of course, involves film stock that goes in a camera and is optically exposed to light and then developed in a chemical and then edited into a final. So film is more of a generic term now. Motion picture is probably more accurate, but a documentary is a motion picture dealing with actual events or fact. So here's another example of some historical events that were dealt with in two different ways. The gentleman on the left is Leo Gray, one of the Tuskegee Airmen who flew with the Red Tails in World War II. The other picture is the filmmaker who made the film Silver Wings and Civil Rights, The Fight to Fly. Think about that. These guys were not even considered to be capable of being pilots because of the discrimination that existed in America at that time. But they wanted to help, and they trained. And guess what? They excelled at it. They became some of the best pilots in World War II. And their outfit was so distinguished that it set itself above many other units. So my client, John Anderson, that's Leo Gray with me and the filmmaker, John Anderson, at a military event. So John told the Tuskegee Airmen story through interviews by the airmen themselves. And that was his primary source material. So John made this picture. It won the audience award at the Miami Festival. And then a couple of years after it was released, George Lucas calls up my client and says, we're going to, well, not George Lucas, but somebody in his office. We want to make a movie about the Tuskegee Airmen. We understand you did this documentary. Will you send us a couple of copies? Well, John's girlfriend now is saying, you ought to sue George Lucas because he made that movie based on yours. Well, no, you can't just take away the whole Tuskegee Airmen story in one documentary. Anybody can make another documentary or a movie about their experiences. But what's interesting to me is when I was putting this slide together and I grabbed the poster from Red Tails, I looked at that airplane in the front under Cuba Gooding's name. That's not even a prop airplane. The United States didn't even have jets in World War II. But guess what? The Germans did. They didn't have a lot of them because they didn't come out into operation until the waning part of the war. But the Red Tails, the Tuskegee Airmen, engaged those jets in combat, and they shot them down, which is quite a testament to their history. And that's one of the reasons that documentaries are valuable, because they tell a true story. And maybe that documentary, Silver Wings, inspired George Lucas to tell that story and bring it out to a lot more people than my client did in his documentary. But I find it very interesting that my client focused more in his title even on the fight to fly. And it was. These guys weren't even allowed to go to the officers club, and yet they were asked to go into combat and take on German jets, which they did in a distinguished manner. So the documentary has a role, its purpose, to depict history and share that history and do it in a true and factual way. And so that's a great example there of one that I was involved in. I was proud to meet Leo Gray and listen to some of his story personally. One of the other documentaries that this filmmaker, John Anderson, made dealt with women in World War II. Women were never allowed to fly in combat. But guess what? The United States had a tremendous, mighty industrial base. And the United States cranked out more aircraft than Hitler would ever be able to make in a short period of time. But somebody had to fly those airplanes, right? So the men became the pilots and were sent overseas. And who was going to fly the airplanes from the factory to the jumping off point in New Jersey or South Carolina, or wherever it would be? Well, it was women. Women who were dying to fly airplanes. They had a passion to be pilots. And they finally were recognized, and they they'd go to a factory in California where a bomber was ready to be flown to New Jersey. And they'd say, "What are we flying today?" They say, "Oh, you're taking a B-25. Well, I'm not checked out on a B-25. Well, here's the manual. Good luck. And they would often fly by not even instrumentation. They'd follow a railroad or a road or something, find their way to New Jersey and deliver it. So documentaries tell these stories that are perhaps unknown and very valuable to young people to know the history of what some of the major contributions have been. Okay, so now here's an interesting one. A documentary it doesn't have to be 90 minutes long. It can be what we call a short. And that's a form of a documentary that is just not as long. It's usually less than 40 minutes. In the movie business, a feature is generally something that is more than 40 minutes. Okay, but it can be a feature documentary, which is a long documentary, or it can be a feature dramatic film. But the documentary content itself should be factual. So here's a tip for you if you're researching. Let's say you want to make a film about the Tuskegee Airmen or something else, the Civil War. Go to the end credits and see what the sources were. Where did they get the material that is in there? Okay. Now, one thing that you should understand is that feature films that deal with true events may not be all true. So what you will see in those cases are that these films are not documentaries, but they're based upon a true event or inspired by a true event. And one of the examples of that went all the way through the courts was the George Clooney movie about the sea captain, Perfect Storm. They used the guy's real name and his boat, but they fictionalized what happened out there that nobody really knows about. And the family felt that the captain's depiction in that movie was defamatory, was bad, it was negative. And they sued the studio. And they lost in the courts because they said that the filmmakers, the studio, did not say that that was true. They said it was based upon and inspired by. So therefore, it was not saying that's exactly what happened. It's just our presentation of it. Now, the poster at the bottom is one of the most famous films from the 20s, Reefer Madness. And this is essentially a propaganda film on the evils of marijuana. And so you see that they're depicting anyone who smoked a joint back then as all of a sudden you're going to be in hell tomorrow. You know, it's the devil's weed. It'll make you crazy. The devil's garden. Okay, so what this tells us, and this very issue that this poster deals with, is being brought up with artificial intelligence or AI today, because we are being told that with the technology we have, we can almost recreate anything in a moving image. We can put a famous person's head on somebody else. We can make it look like any person actually did something they didn't do. So a documentary film is supposed to deal with historical true facts. But what if somebody makes a film that they claim is true, and maybe it isn't? And I'm sure a lot of people would disagree with Reefer Madness. I know there are a lot of examples of positive experiences with it, including health uses. So maybe this film wasn't really a true documentary. It was a propaganda film. And during the big war, World War II, Hitler had a fantastic PR guy. He had a guy that was just in charge of creating positive propaganda for Germany. And there are a lot of books and records about the deception that the United States and Britain used to deceive the Germans. The most famous example is that, in spite of George Patton, the general, his craziness on the one hand, but his brilliance as a general, he got in the doghouse because he slapped a soldier who was undergoing battle fatigue. It wasn't called PTSD then, but he was put on the sidelines before the Normandy invasion. But Hitler and Hitler's people thought that Patton was going to lead the invasion. So what the Allies did was they created a fake army that supposedly Patton was going to lead, and they deceived the Germans successfully into thinking that they were going to land in a different part of France than where the real invasion came. So there were there was a film made about one of those deceptions. And it was how the British found a homeless person who had died and they didn't have any family. There's a factual documentary style film that's on Netflix now. And they dressed this guy up as a soldier and put phony orders on him and dropped him off the coast of Spain, where they figured somebody would find him and they would report his orders to Hitler and deceive them about another part of the war. And it worked. So propaganda is something you got to be aware of, and it can be used for a good or a bad purpose. But understand the difference between fictional accounts that are based upon, inspired by, and are not truly representations of correct history. Now, something that comes up all the time is fair use and copyright. As a general rule, the United States copyright laws are designed to protect you if you create something that is your inspired work. Now, in order to protect you, you've got to get it down in some tangible form, in writing or in front of a camera or some other way. So that's the expression of copyright. But fair use, a documentary filmmaker might say, well, can I just use like 30 seconds of it? That's not a lot, right? Is that okay? So you need to understand what fair use is. And we start from the perspective that there's no minimal use that is okay. To use somebody else's copyrighted work requires permission. And that's called a license or a clearance. Those are the buzzwords. So what is fair use then? And is there any exception to having to get that written permission? Yes. If it's reasonable and if it doesn't compete with the other work in a commercial way. And so the example I'm going to show you here to demonstrate this is Michael Jackson. Obviously, Michael had a huge hit with Beat It. And he had this incredible video that many of you may remember. Okay, and that was totally commercial, out there, protected by copyright, owned by Michael, his publishing company, and his record company. Well, along comes this comedian guy who you see in the picture at the bottom of this slide, Weird Al Yankovic. And Weird Al made a career out of parody, making fun of other things. So Weird Al did his own video that mocked and patterned Beat It. You can see Weird Al's got the same red jacket Michael has on. He's got the same looking actors in his video. The melody of his parody is exactly identical to Beat It, but he did it about food. So if you look it up, it's really, it is pretty funny. But instead of beat it, no one wants to beat it, feed it. He was like, eat it, if it gets cold, reheat it. You know, and he didn't get any permission from Michael Jackson or his music company or publishing, because he's not saying he was singing Beat It. It's another complete musical work. And it's not really competing with Michael Jackson's song, because it's clear that it's not. It's not a cover. Now let's talk for a minute about what is a cover. You hear this in music all the time. And this is important for filmmakers and attorneys too, because in order to get the permission, let's say fair use is not going to apply. I'll give you an example. One of my filmmakers wanted to use a song that came out in the 60s that was very identified with the Vietnam War. And it was called "We Got to Get Out of This Place." And it was recorded and made famous by a rock group from the time, Eric Burden and the Animals. And it's very recognizable. You hear it on classic rock all the time. We got to get out of this place if it's the last thing we ever do. Okay, so my client said in the very beginning, Bill, I want that song in my work. I want it in my film. And I said, it's going to cost you because we're going to have to get permission from two places. One, from the people who own the copyright to the song, which is usually the songwriters and what's called their music publishers, which we'll talk about in more detail later, but they own the rights to the melody and the lyric. And then you have to get permission from whoever owns what's called the master recording that was released that we all hear on the radio today. And now coming up is Eric Burden the Animal. You got to get out of this place. Okay, great. So I said to my client that you got a budget for that. That's not going to be cheap because that's a really famous song. And she didn't pay attention to me. And she didn't ask me to get a clearance. And I told her, look, Gabrielle, here's your options. Instead of putting in Eric Burden and the Animals master, why don't we just get a permission to do our own version of it? That's called covering it. We'll hire a local rock band. We'll tell them we want it to sound like Eric Burden and the Animals, and we'll get the license for the copyright. And then we'll do our own master recording of that song, which we will own and can put in the movie. But she didn't want to do that. She wanted that absolute version. So she waits until they're in post-production. They're under the gun. They've, like a lot of filmmakers, they spent most of their money shooting the movie, and now they're in editing and they don't have much left. And they find out about these delivery requirements that include showing that you have permission to use that song that you've already put in there. It cost her $17,000 for me to get the license to that song. And she scraped up the dough and did it. But if you're on the front end of something and you know that you want to use music that is not free or is not going to be under the fair use category, then you have to plan for getting a license. But if your film is educational and if your use of the work is, this work is non-commercial, and maybe it is a parody, then it can be used in a documentary or another form of film without a license. And I've used it in, I guess we wouldn't call it a documentary, but it wasn't a feature film. There's a sound effect comedian, Michael Winslow, who was in the Police Academy movies. And Michael was famous for making all kinds of crazy noises with his voice. And we did a movie at Universal of Michael in front of a live audience doing different comedy sketches. And he did famous songs like, I Don't Want to Be a Hero. Michael came out in a wig, a red dress, and Michael's thin, so he actually looked pretty good in it. Stockings and high heels. And he was doing, I don't want to be a hero, to the actual music. Well, when I delivered that, and that went on HBO, and we had to meet the legal requirements, I wrote an opinion letter as a lawyer that, in my opinion, and based on the case law, Michael's interpretation of that song was a fair use under a parody exception to having to get permission. And it was accepted. Nobody ever complained. So you have to understand that generally speaking, fair use doesn't mean you can just use a little bit and get away with it. It means you got to figure out what the actual use is, how it affects the work that it relates to, and there may be some exceptions. So now there's a couple of boring slides in here. I'll try and cover them as quickly as possible just to give you the concept. If you're getting a license for something, let's say we want permission for the song. Okay, great. Before they tell you how much they're going to charge you for the license, they want to know, what are you going to do with it? Well, we're going to put it in a documentary film. Okay. Where is that documentary film going to go? Well, anywhere we can sell it, right? We want it to be on TV, streaming, on airplanes. We want it anywhere we can get it to be. That's called an all rights license. That's a comprehensive rights, because the right to display the film on TV is different from schools, different from selling it on a DVD in a store, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what if you don't need all of those rights? Or what if the person who owns the rights doesn't want to give you everything? What if they say, okay, I'll give you the right to use the song in your documentary, but I'm not going to give you the right to put it in a video game. So then you have to decide if you want to take the license under that condition or not. That would be an example of a limited or narrow license where the people owning the rights are reserving some of the rights to themselves. And many times in documentaries especially, but feature films as well, the distributor will create a print version of the script and release it as a book. One of the most famous examples of feature film is where Tom Clancy wrote all these thrillers. He wrote his first big book was called Red October, about a Russian submarine that defected. And when that film hit, starring Sean Connery as the Russian submarine commander, they immediately released a paperback book with Sean Connery's face on the cover, Red October. And it was a big seller. So the art that was tied to the film became a marketing success, cross-marketing, and it's an example of exercising publishing rights that are part of these rights that go with the movie itself. And in many cases, the documentary film can spin off, in some cases, games, and in many cases, books. That's literary publishing. So we have to pay attention to all of the different rights that are involved in getting permissions for your content in the documentary film. And once you've made the film, what can you do with it? Now, there are other aspects to the license. Let's say you get all the rights that you wanted, okay? And you're really happy with that. But let's say they tell you, you can have everything you want, but it's non-exclusive. Well, what does that mean? Well, if it's non-exclusive, it means that whoever granted you the rights can exercise the rights in the same media that you own. They can make their own documentary. They can put the song in their own movie. So you don't have the only right to it. You just have the right, but it's shared with them. So that would be a non-exclusive. If you want an exclusive license, you want to take this, whatever it is, off the shelf, then you're going to pay more for it. And they're going to charge you accordingly. So the type of license and the scope of it, how broad or narrow, and the terms are extremely important to your distributor. Now, one way you can take advantage of this, let's say you just don't have the money, you're making a documentary film, you want to take it to film festivals when you're done to try and get a distributor to look at it, and you just don't have the money to pay for the music you want. you can get a festival only license, which they may give you for free. And that makes you really happy because now you can take it to Sundance, you can enter it in competition, and you've got the permission to do that. But the license only grants you the festival performance, not any commercial use of the film later. So that can be a trap, because if you get that and you get your deal with your distributor, the distributor then says, oh, you mean you only had festival rights? You don't have this cleared or licensed for us to put out on Netflix? Well, we got to renegotiate that. Okay, well, go renegotiate. Now you're in the situation of having to go renegotiate with your back to the wall, hoping they don't know that you got a Netflix deal pending, because if they do, they're going to charge you a lot more. So all this, if you think about it going in, what do I want to do with my film? How am I going to budget for this? And we'll talk later about budgeting. But those are the types of licenses, and those are the things that are most commonly dealt with, whether it's all rights or only some rights, and whether it's exclusive or non-exclusive. So what we've just talked about is the bundle of rights. And when we say media, that just means a medium, a form of how this film that you've made, this documentary motion picture, will be distributed. Is it going to go, on TV, in other forms of release? And you can see all the different things, that can spin off from this. You might have a piece of key art from your documentary that could be sold as a poster, for example, or a t-shirt. There's all kinds of spin-offs. So the format of your film is whether it's on film medium or it's a digital master. But where it is distributed is considered the territories, and that includes geographically on the planet and even outer space, and on airplanes and trains and ships. And let's talk about this for media for a second. You have this boilerplate language you see in licenses for documentaries. It'll say all rights in all media in perpetuity, including anything that hasn't even been invented and may be thought of in the future. Now you might say, well, what good is that? I mean, all I need is digital. But I'll give you an example from the 70s. Back then, I was working with a very famous woman author named Andre Norton, who was one of the few grandmasters of science fiction. Probably never heard of her, but if you're a sci-fi fan, you would have. She wrote a book about a character, a superhero, who could telepathically communicate with animals. And that book was optioned for a film. And the film was made. And she had a lawyer, and the studio that bought the rights had a lawyer. And the studio's law firm put in the permission they got from her that they had the right to put it in theaters and in all other forms of media, whether or not then known or invented in the future. Well, when I met her in the 1980s, she said, I never liked that film because I didn't like the way they dyed the cat that they used as the panther black. And I think it may have harmed it. But I just see that somebody told me this movie was out in Blockbuster. What's Blockbuster? I said, well, Blockbuster's where people go and rent movies on videotape. Well, shouldn't they be paying me for that? And I said, well, Andre, it depends on your contract. What did your contract say? Well, I got it here somewhere. So she shows me the contract. Guess what? It said that the studio had bought the rights to any form of distribution, whether or not then known in the 70s or invented in the future, which videotape was. She never got a penny off the rentals of that film on video and wouldn't get it for DVDs or CDs either, because those were not known at the time, but they were included in the permissions that the studio got. So that's why some language is in there. We don't know where technology is going. We don't know what it's going to be called. If you want a movie delivered directly to your sunglass lenses so you can see it while you got them on, that might be something that you need to think about in advising a client. Get an all rights license that has that language in it. Then we're protected. And if you're a filmmaker, pay attention to that and make sure that your permission covers all media that it might be suitable for. Some documentaries have high concept ideas that are suitable for spinoffs as gaming, as games at home, or or merchandise. So that should all be thought of when the media is being considered. And it's all bundled in, because whoever creates it in the beginning, the content that you want to use, owns all of those rights. And you will own all the rights to your copyrighted material as well. So then the term of an agreement, perpetuity, is just forever and ever and ever, amen. Or it can be for a number of years. Many licenses are based on how films are sold. They might be sold around the world for 7 years. And then after 7 years, the rights all come back to you and you can start over. The first film I ever worked on was in the 1980s. And it was a ninja film made by Grandmaster Whitacre. And he struggled to get distribution because the martial arts choreography was outstanding. But the acting and the script, which was shot by a Korean director who didn't speak English, was pretty pathetic. So it got a little bit of distribution, but it didn't make any money. And then years later, it was shot on 35 millimeter film. Years later, some guy who was a fan of film bought one of those reels off of eBay. And he was friends with the people who owned Cinema Draft House in Texas. And he took it into his buddies. He said, hey, would you put this up on the projector just for grins and see what it looks like? And they put it up there. They thought it was fabulous. It was so camp. It was so bad. It was good. So then he explored from us getting rights to remaster and release the film in their art house theaters, which they did. And it got a 25-year anniversary re-release as a cult film. And I've done licenses for that now in New Zealand, Australia, Germany, all still after 25 years. So the term of it is important. Eventually the original distribution was picked up by MGM, but it expired. So now when we're granting licenses to other people, we can say that we're not under a perpetuity agreement with the studio. It was for a term of years that has expired. So that's why that can be important. Now, music licenses for documentaries. The word synchronization refers to a type of license that just allows the music to be put under the moving images in the film. There's a lot of confusion over the word master, and here's why. In music, when music is finalized, it's edited, the producer gets on there, the engineer, all the levels are set, everything is happy. It's put in a digital format called a master. That may be in an MP3 or 4 file. But in any event, that's a master recording, meaning it's a final version of the work. Okay? So that's great. And that can be stored in any digital format and shipped around. And by the way, you may be aware that an MP3 is a common format to download or stream music on, but the so-called MP3 is not the highest quality audio master. it was created for convenience of compressing files and sending them around on the internet and other places and ways. But an MP4 is a better quality of a music master. So depending on how you want to listen to your music and in what level of fidelity, you need to know what the master consists of. But that refers to the digital format of the music. Now, some people get confused over, well, we want a master license for our music. What they're really saying is they want one of these broad all rights licenses to use the music in the documentary film in all media. And they're not referring specifically at that point to the music master itself, but to an all rights type of license for 1 or more years or terms. So don't be confused about the use of the word master. Got to specify what that really means. Now, who do you get a license for music from? Well, from the copyright owners who created it, wrote it, and own the copyright. But in the case of a recording that has been released through a record label or an international music company like Sony or Columbia, you've got to get the permission to use their master recording of it, which is their studio recording. Now, if you just want to do your own cover that we talked about, your own version, and hire your local favorite rock band to create something that sounds like Bob Seger or whoever, you can do that. And you can just get the copyright permission and then create your own master. And you will own that. You will own that master recording. Now, music publishing is the term in the music business that refers to how music rights are owned and used. And one thing you should really understand, when music is placed, let's say on the internet, and it's accessed on your computer or your phone or tablet, if you want to own your personal version of that, like you would use to buy a record, buy a CD, download it into your computer, that is a purchase. That is considered as though you were in a store buying it, and you pay a fee for that, right? Now, you're not allowed to sell it, but you own that. But if you're just listening to it, let's say you go on one of the music streaming services and you say, create a Bob Dylan channel or a Michael Jackson channel, and you get to listen to all that music that you like, but you're not downloading that into your computer and you're not saving that. You're just listening to it. That's a performance license. And why is that different? Because the people who own the copyright and wrote the song, they're getting paid in a different way for a performance or a purchase. So a performance has to be paid for by whoever is letting you listen to the people who own the copyright. And the way that payment is made is through what we call music publishing companies. You may have heard of BMI, Broadcast Music, or ASCAP, and I misspelled ASCAP there. That should be ASCAP. Okay, but it's considered a performance royalty, and it's big money. I'll give you an example. Dolly Parton, who we all know here in Tennessee and love, most of us, she wrote this little song when she broke up with her first mentor, Porter Wagoner, and it was called I Will Always Love You. And she had a pretty nice time with that song. But along comes Miss Whitney Houston and makes a movie called The Bodyguard with then big-time star Kevin Costner. And Whitney picks the song I Will Always Love You as a theme song for that movie. And she gets the rights from Dolly to do that. And the movie is a fantastic success. And all of a sudden, all kinds of people discover that song. Well, every time that song was performed in the movie, Dolly got paid as the copyright owner for the performance royalty. So she made tons of dough. I mean, in the bluegrass field, Elvis Presley recorded Blue Moon of Kentucky that Bill Monroe wrote and owned. And he was a real stickler. He would never allow a drum on stage when his music was being performed. And they said, Mr. Monroe, how did you feel about that boy Elvis Presley recording your song? And he said, them was powerful royalty checks. Well, he was happy about it because he made tons of money off of Elvis recording his song and having it performed. So music publishing is a big, big deal. And if you have an opportunity to make a movie and put music in it, I would highly encourage you to write your own song for that and put it in your own movie and own the rights to it. Because if that movie gets picked up and aired on Netflix, you will get paid every time that film airs because the music will be performed. And as part of the delivery requirements to make sure those payments are made, filmmakers have to give their distributor what's called a music cue sheet. And it will say, if it's your song in your film, written by you, used in this scene for 2 minutes at the closing end or behind this scene as a context for that. And payments will be made to you forever, as long as that film is aired commercially. So music publishing, learn to pay attention to it. And if you're a songwriter or a creator, I would highly encourage you to become affiliated with one of these companies, Broadcast Music or ASCAP. You can sign up for free as a writer, pay them $300 if you're a publisher and you own a music catalog, but be familiar with music publishing and pay great attention to it. Now, if you are a filmmaker and you just want to license music and you're confused by how to do it, there's a company called Harry Fox. You can call them up and say, I want this song and I want a non-exclusive license to put it in my documentary, and they'll charge you some money and help you do that. But BMI and ASCAP now have teamed up to do a title search. So if you go online to Song View, you can put in the artist or the song title and it'll tell you who owns it if you want to try and get this license on behalf of a client, if you're an attorney getting the clearances, or if you're a filmmaker. So now let's talk a little bit about budgets. How are we doing on time, Jonathan? I've got 5:44. Where should we go stop for questions?
Well, if you want to go through and talk about the budgets, I think we could then do Q&A after that.
Okay, great. Well, then we'll wrap that part of the presentation.
Yep.
Okay, so budget considerations are simply the simplest way is everything in front of the camera and everything behind the camera that costs money. You got to figure out how to handle it, right? And that's, camera, cast and crew. The reason I got Morgan Freeman up there is a lot of times in documentaries, it's helpful to the value of your film to have a celebrity narrate. So if you can budget for that, that's great. The picture on the right is Brushy Mountain Prison. It's closed, but it's in a remote area of Tennessee. It would be available as a set. I mean, and you remember Shawshank Redemption, they filmed it in an old closed prison. Well, Brushy Mountain is an example of something that would be available to you at relatively low cost, give you big production value. But you got to remember to pay your lawyer, the accountant, and any insurance is going to be required. So equipment is not damaged, or you don't say or do something that will get you in trouble legally because a permission was not obtained. And there's a great link there on documentary budgeting if you want to use it. Financing, just so that you understand, loans are where you have to pay them back. And if you don't, they take your movie away. And you may have to put up some collateral. So that's not a popular form of financing. Equity is where somebody who can afford to give you the money gives it to you, and they get a percentage of your profit if you make it. This organization that's sponsoring this today is an example of a sponsorship or a grant. You can apply through the council and what Jonathan introduced at the beginning for some financial assistance to make your documentary or other areas. And then crowdfunding, everybody's heard of GoFundMe. That is a legitimate way to raise money if you want to set up a page. It's not, you can't really promise people a piece of your profit because it would be minuscule for a $10 or $100 contribution. But you can send them a copy of the script, a signed photo, something else in exchange. And it is legit and it's recognized legally, but there are new rules under the Securities and Exchange Commission on how much you can do and how to do that. And, marketing and distribution, festivals. There's a link to Sundance, the Cannes Film Festival, the American Film Market. These are ways to get your film out in front of people, and hopefully distributors will come and see it and make a deal. And then how do you get distribution? Will your film be in theaters? Probably not, but it might be in art house theaters. The link I provided there is some of the best documentary streaming services that are now out there. So you can check that out. And if you've done a historical doc, museums and schools have budgets to buy licenses and show movies for educational purposes. So you can do that. A huge source of content for documentaries is the Library of Congress. They've got motion pictures, still pictures, audio, interviews with old-timey people, all kinds of stuff. And it's available to you for free. So check out Library of Congress. There's also a link to the National Film Registry with film resources. And there's a link I've included for how to get free music, classical music, all kinds of music that is available to you as a filmmaker without cost. That's a wrap on that. And we can go to Q&A.
All right, everyone. So we're going to go into Q&A, and the way that we're going to handle that is we are going to allow people to ask questions through the chat feature. So if you have a question, you can put your question in the chat, and I'm going to ask William each of the questions that are asked. You can also use the raise your hand feature if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask a question. That is also possible. And we will, if we have a lot on both sides, we'll go through those. But feel free, if you have a question, to throw that in the chat or to raise your hand using the raise your hand feature, and then we will get to your questions. William, I will thank you so much, by the way. This has been a wonderful presentation. And the chat was a little active while you were going. So there was one question about the Weird Al and the Beat It, Eat It licensing. Denise Shackelford said, I always understood that Weird Al got licenses since you can't really know whether a use is a fair use until it goes to court.
First part of that is probably true. In many cases, it's easier to get the license than it is to argue about it. Somebody can always challenge whether it was a fair use or not. However, waiting to go to court to determine fair use is probably not the best advice. I would consult with an attorney who has done some research on the elements of fair use, whether it is competitive with the original work. I mean, I give you an example specifically. I did a feature with a client one time called Cartoon Crazies. And what my client did is he went back and researched all the public domain cartoons where copyright had not been renewed. And we found one that was a Warner Brothers that had Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd. And my client said, I'm going to do that. And I said, great. And I think it qualifies. There's no copyright on it. It would almost be public domain, meaning there's no copyright existing. But I said, Warner's going to sue us. And he said, okay, let's go ahead and do that episode. Now, we could only put on the cover the Bugs Bunny as it was shown in that frame. We couldn't do a new Bugs Bunny version for the cover of that because that would have been appropriating their character. And we didn't want to go to court. So we planned for that. And when they did come out after us and threatened to sue us, we said, why don't you just buy the master? We'll sell it to you and take it off the market. And we did that. And that was a strategy. So going to court is going to be ultimately a legal opinion by your attorney as to whether you fall into the category of fair use or not. And as I said in the beginning, it's always best to get the license if you can. But if you can't, you might want to plan for how you deal with someone if they do contest it.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for having me. This is a super cool event. I was tapped recently to do a documentary, and that's why I'm here, or I'm sort of in like the production phase of it. And the subject matter of the documentary specifically is protesters who are protesting certain political upheavals in the 60s and 70s, and we're going to be interviewing a lot of them. A lot of them are still alive and still actively talking about this kind of stuff. I'm wondering how worried we need to be about them expressing opinions about certain politicians being racist, anti-Semitic, supporting certain causes, and them expressing their opinions about that, especially about people who are still alive and might not take kindly to someone on camera saying such and such supported such and such evil ideas or thinks this way. Is that all protected under that's just some guy's opinion, or do we need to like set aside a fund for potentially getting sued for libel, slander, that kind of thing? Like what's the deal there?
Well, a couple of issues. One, you'll notice that in a lot of cases, even on radio, there'll be a disclaimer at the beginning that says, the opinions expressed by people on this show are not those of CBS News or this station. Well, that's saying basically it's somebody's opinion, they're entitled to it. And as long as it's not criminally defamatory, I wouldn't air an interview that calls somebody a child molester or something that is what we call in the law per se defamation. But that's one issue, is screening the content in that way. The second issue is in a documentary format, you get a little bit of a pass like the news media do because it's for educational and it may or may not be held to the same standard. If you're shooting a protest live, let's say something happens in Market Square in Tennessee or, on Music Row, and you run out there with a camera and you want to grab some footage, the best thing to do there is to try and put up a sign that says, hey, we're going to be filming in this area. If you happen to be in here, you might be on camera. And if you make that prominent enough and take a picture of it and put it in your file, it's a good thing to show your distributor that, hey, we warned people. We couldn't possibly get permission from 300 people who were doing that, but we told them. And they went ahead and came into our area anyway. So that's another thing you can do. But if you're interviewing one-on-one and you get a consent from that person to use their interview, then generally their opinions are not going to be actionable against you because it's not you making the statement. And yes, you are publishing it, which means disseminating it publicly. And that's one of the issues of defamation, that the bad content is published, but also it's what was the intent and what is the scope of it. And I think if you're careful about how you monitor that, it shouldn't be a problem legally.
Great. Thanks so much.
Looks like we have another related question. Alex Rockefeller asked, are there times you don't have to have a release when interviewing someone, like if a candid news interview, for example?
A candid what?
A news interview. So like an interview on the news, is there an instance where you don't have to have a release when you're interviewing someone for a documentary?
The answer is yes, but it depends on where the footage is going to be used later. If it's going to be put in a commercial documentary that is sold on a distribution or streaming platform, then that is making a profit motive or a commercial use of it. And that affects the fair use because it is for profit. So then you got to look at the other context. Is it reasonable under the circumstances? Is it just a couple of seconds? Or is it a prime featured content? In which case a license would be required, even if it's off the cuff. So the general rule is get the consent. If you're a filmmaker, have a 1 or 2 paragraph consent handy to use in those situations and ask people, is it okay if I film you? And if it's not feasible to get consent, then you're going to have to take your chances of how much of something is featured and used. And ultimately, it's going to come down to talking to an insurance underwriter who's looking at your content and deciding whether that is going to be actionable or a basis for a suit against his client, the insurance company, that is going to stand between a suit against you and your distributor. So it's going to be a judgment call. You know, I've had that happen with a lot of things. I mean, somebody in the Blair Witch Project, they were making up men on the street interviews. And they said to this woman, will you be in our film and pretend that you've heard about this situation in the past of an axe murderer here? She said, oh yeah, I'll do that. And this woman was great. She had a 2 or 3 year old baby in her arms. And she said, oh, I've heard about that Blair Witch. It was horrible. They were murdering children. And when she was saying that, the child was going like this. And then it reached over and put its hand over the mother's mouth. I mean, it was a brilliant scene. It looked so real. And of course, and she said, yeah, I've heard about that Rustin Parr character. So when I'm delivering the film, the insurance guy, he's going to give us $1 million advance from Artisan as soon as he binds this policy. And he tells me that he can't do it because I don't have any paperwork on Rustin Parr. And I'm going, well, that's great. That's not a problem because he never existed. It's a fictional name. It's not even depicted in the film other than that fictional name was thrown out. And the guy said, yeah, but you were claiming this film was true, right? Initial marketing. And what if somebody in that county named Parr comes to us and says, we're suing those guys because they said our grandfather was an axe murderer. I couldn't believe it, but he wasn't going to issue the policy. We weren't going to get our advance. So we had to go get affidavits from the driver's license and the warranty deeds and all the records of that county that there was no one named Parr. And that alleviated the risk that they saw as a potential risk. And they cleared it and gave us the insurance. And we were able to satisfy the distributor. It was covered and we got our money. But it was, it's a close call. What if we'd said John Smith? And there had been 10 people named Smith in that county who made a claim of defamation against their ancestor.
Mm-hmm.
That could have been a big problem, which shows why you ought to be careful in thinking about this stuff. Like I read scripts where they want to talk about Einstein. I said, why don't you just say rocket scientist? It makes it a lot easier in dealing with potential licenses.
Can you talk more about E&O insurance? And do you advise filmmakers to get it, the errors and emissions insurance?
Yes, it's normally required for any film that's going to be exhibited in any kind of significant way.
Okay.
I gave another example in Blair Witch, and it wasn't really a documentary, it was a mockumentary, but it did use real people and scenes that were not reenacted. And in the beginning, the filmmaker threw a bag of marshmallows into a shopping cart and poked the camera down on the Stay Puft label and said, oh, we got to have marshmallows too. Well, we had to get a permission from that marshmallow company. The reason being that they could claim their brand was used without their permission. So yes, errors and omissions protects against not just not having a music license for a use of music, but any product or any personal information. Sometimes you'll see on cable TV shows that they don't want to pay the clearance fee to get a license plate or the name of a garage or something. And it'll just be blurred out because it's kind of like reality TV and it doesn't affect it that much anyway. So yes, errors and omissions insurance is very common. It is normally required in a documentary, and you should plan on having to secure it in order to close your deal with the distributor.
So Jason Palmer had a question. You mentioned earlier that using copyrighted music in a film requires acquisition of a sync license, which allows you to sync the music with the visual content. Is it also typical to get a public performance license for the music based on the assumption that the film would be displayed publicly, or have courts interpreted sync licenses to encompass public performance?
Well, the sync license is a generic term. So the answer to that question goes back to our discussion about the bundle of rights. What rights have been granted in the sync license? Okay, you've got the right to put it in your movie, but now what right do you have to use it after it's been incorporated into the film? And that has to be negotiated from the source of the license at the time the license is secured. It's either broad all rights, which would include public performances, yes, or it's limited, that it can only be used in the film in context, and it cannot be re-performed in any other context unless that right is specifically negotiated for and granted. So anything that the filmmaker may want to use the music for needs to be specifically negotiated and granted, because the licenses will also typically have language that will say, and I put these in if I'm granting it, all rights not expressly granted to you in writing in this license are reserved. So if there's any doubt, we've kept it. If you want it, you've got to expressly define it and negotiate and pay for it.
Maymon asked a question, a couple of questions, but I'm going to give the first one because it relates to the errors and omissions insurance. She asked, but does an E&O insurance mean one does not have to pay for someone else's work, or that one can't sue damages for not having permission and that you still have to pay them? So, okay.
As I understand the question, the errors and omissions insurance does not take the place of a license. It is a condition of getting the distribution deal, because it's like if you borrow someone's car and have a wreck. You may have had permission to borrow the car, so you're not going to be accused of theft or anything, but if you caused a wreck, you can be sued. And if you don't have insurance for driving someone else's car, you will be personally liable. So the errors and omissions is an insurance policy that protects the named insured, which is not you, it's your distributor. It protects your distributor from using your material in distribution in a commercial way that may cause a lawsuit. And therefore, the named insured distributor, are not going to be liable. You may or may not be a named insured also, so you would be protected in that suit. And some distributors, they specify the limits of the policy. It's going to be 2 million or whatever it is, and you've got to pay the insurance company for that amount of coverage, just like in your car insurance. Do you want personal liability protection or collision, or what are the limits of the coverage and what type of coverage are you buying? So that all has to be specified in your errors and omissions policy. And the distributor will give you a delivery schedule that will specify that you have to meet those limits.
And then a follow-up to her question, or a separate part of her question, she said that she wants to make a documentary for her nonprofit that features her music and other artists that she plans to interview and have perform in the documentary. What's the most equitable way to set up the agreements with the other artists? It will be streamed.
I dealt with this recently, where one of my clients signed a deal with Sony Columbia, and he's the artist and he's the creator. And now we're talking about how do we split the music publishing with the label. Sony Columbia doesn't even want any part of it. But between my client, who'll start with owning 100%, and the label that's going to be distributed by Sony Columbia, Sony Music, how is that going to be divided? So probably the most equitable deal in that scenario is first get all the licenses you need for further performances and also on camera and sync. And then with respect to each song, you will probably do a split of the publishing, where they're either going to keep 100% and you don't get any of it, or in return for you including it in the film and giving it some exposure, you will take a percentage of the performance royalties. In many cases, it's a 50-50 split, but depending on, if it's Vince Gill and he agrees to do your documentary, he may not want to give you any, or certainly not half. But depending on the artist and their willingness to negotiate, you would do what's called a split or a a sharing of the publishing royalties, and then the artist publishing company would be included in the contract to administer theirs, and you would get your share. And those would be reported on the music cue sheet to make sure everybody gets paid. But there
All
has
right.
to be a music publishing company to administer that. If a writer doesn't have a publishing company, it's got to go through some publishing company. You've either got to set one up or run it through somebody else's.
The last question I'll ask, I see this one and then we'll stop. Should filmmakers form an LLC for a film to protect themselves?
Generally speaking, if you're not going to have private investors, a simple corporation is sufficient. And it can be done for tax purposes as what's called an S corporation through your own tax return. It's very simple and easy to do. If you have investors, the LLC is preferred because it protects both you and the investors from lawsuits, no personal liability, and it allows them to have a profit share in whatever you do, but it doesn't give them any management or voting. So if you put investors in your corporation and you sell off more than 51%, they're going to control it, which is what happens to some of these big guys. They get like Apple. He gets voted out of his own company because the shareholders own 51%. So LLC is good if investors are involved. Sole, simple S corporation is good if not. And sometimes you want both. Because let's say you want to put your production brand on everything you do, but you've got investors in this deal. Then you might sometimes see, MGM presents this movie by this production company in association with, and so your brand is on there, but no, you don't really need to brand your LLC because you're not going to use that over and over and over as a presenting credit.
I do want to remind everyone that this is an educational program and that nothing that you've asked or any questions that have been answered constitutes legal advice. This is educational in purpose. So just to remember that. Thank you, William, for an incredibly informative presentation. I see a lot of positive feedback in the chat, people expressing their appreciation for a great program, helpful information, just a lot of positive feedback. So really appreciate that. Thank you everyone for attending today.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks everyone for participating.